so. All right, cool. Thanks for everybody for sticking around after lunch and attending this session here. I just want to say thanks to the B-Sides crew. This is a pretty awesome event, and I've been eyeing it up for a couple of years. This is my first time attending and first time speaking, so I didn't know what to expect, but I've loved everything that I've experienced so far. So my name's Mike Burns. Today I'm going to be talking about network segmentation without a network engineer, how to defend against lateral movement and ransomware using the Windows host-based firewall and Active Directory. I'm local here to Baltimore, originally from Western New York, but I moved down here about, probably about 15 years ago. Currently, I'm a security engineer at Cisco Meraki. This talk has no affiliation with Cisco whatsoever. Formerly, I was a senior technical architect and principal consultant at Mandiant, so did a lot of assessments and responded to a lot of IRs and saw a lot of ransomware attacks. Also a former CISO at ThinkStack. So ThinkStack is a local Baltimore managed service provider, and really honestly cut my teeth there in security. Saw a lot of stuff, a lot of good things, a lot of bad things with the customers that we manage. But at ThinkStack, we were certainly in a position to increase their security posture. So I just wanted to give them a quick shout out. The agenda for today, we're going to be talking about the anatomy of a potential ransomware attack. They take on many different forms. I'm just going to kind of talk in a basic terms. How network segmentation can combat that and the pros and cons of network segmentation. A little education about the Windows firewall itself. From my personal experience when working with clients, I've advised them, hey, we should enable the Windows firewall. We should change the rules, and they're always terrified. So out in the crowd, who here has Windows firewall enabled within their network? So decent amount. How many are confident in the way it's configured? A lot, yeah. Well, it might be working, right? It's working if it's enabled, but I'm going to be talking about some pitfalls that I've personally seen, and how we can deploy out a strategy to strengthen that host-based firewall, and particularly talk about connection security rules. So this is something that was relatively new to me, and when learning about Windows firewall, is anybody here familiar with connection security rules in the Windows firewall? Oh, looks like I hit a niche. So again, when I was at ThinkStack, this is something I stumbled upon and learned a lot about. And I was like, wow, if we configure this properly, we could do some pretty awesome stuff with the Windows firewall to combat attacker lateral movement and potentially ransomware. And I'm going to be talking about a strategy how to roll that out. So here's a quick diagram put together by Microsoft. I'm not sure the particular attacker they have, up here they labeled the attacker family that this was, but this is a basic ransomware attack of once an attacker gains persistence in the network, whether they brute force a password on a VPN, that VPN or that edge device has a vulnerability. We've seen a lot of those lately. I think the Avanti one just hit MITRE. I'm not sure if that was actually their edge appliance or not, but nonetheless, when attackers gain a foothold through compromising the edge, or in most cases phishing, I think a lot of people are aware of. One of the first things they do is on that machine, they're going to run Mimikatz, they're going to dump credentials, and they're going to do recon on the environment. And if they don't get the credentials they want on that machine that allows them to escalate their privileges or potentially domain admin, they're going to begin to move laterally within the network. So you can see here this lateral movement. They'll begin to connect to other machines that are within that network, and mostly likely on the same VLAN or in a flat network. So it's not only workstations, they could also be attempting to connect to servers. And they're going to do that same activity of dumping credentials, doing recon, seeing what other machines they can connect to until they find credentials that they're able to decipher or utilize or pass the hash, whatever it may be, until they can escalate to a elevated admin, domain admin, whatever it may be, to deploy their ransomware. So in the many IRs I've seen, this is the common attack path that attackers are taking. So the issue with flat networks, when I'm talking about a flat network, I'm, from my experience mostly seeing a network where the domain controller, the servers, the workstations, all the member servers, all the IAM services are all able to talk to each other on any port, any protocol. That might be a very large subnet. That actually might be a couple VLANs, but there's no protection in between those VLANs. And that's prime for lateral movement and the deployment of ransomware. And within those flat networks, rarely are you have the ability to do any kind of intrusion protection or intrusion detection that could assist you in identifying this lateral movement. And with that, very few opportunities to increase your monitoring or monitoring for any kind of lateral movement. So even if there are a couple of VLANs in the environment, from my experience, again, they're wide open and there's no enforcement from VLAN to VLAN. So how can network segmentation help? When I talk about these flat networks, you can divide up a large network into multiple smaller networks. And within those smaller networks, you can be deploying out typically in the layman terms of network segmentation, we're thinking of routers, layer 3 switches, internal firewalls, where you can be deploying out those access control lists to block ports and protocols to prohibit, say, workstations from communicating to the server over any port. So like a file server operates over port 445. You would want to make an ACL that says, I'm going to allow my my workstations to connect to a file server or port 445. That would be an ideal situation, but commonly, as I mentioned, even if you do have VLANs, there's really it's rare to see enforcement between those VLANs. And you could be blocking additional ports that attackers like to use in their lateral movement, which is WMI, WinRM, RDP, really those management ports that allow them to move laterally and conduct their attack. Also, with network segmentation, you could reduce the attack surface. So, as I mentioned, one of the tactics or techniques that an attacker uses, they perform recon. Who else can I connect to? What ports can I connect to? On any of those ports, is it running a service that's potentially vulnerable that could allow me to run unauthenticated code to then pivot to that machine? So that, again, that's what I've seen in a lot of these incidences. Attackers are finding these vulnerable services because they're just wide open to the entire network, and if they're not finding credentials on that workstation, they might move to a server that has a vulnerable service that's running and jump to that server, dump creds, and deploy ransomware. Also, in network segmentation, you could be utilizing it to isolate sensitive data or services. So again, domain controller, any kind of service that runs identity management, so your Okta, your Okta agents that might be running on a server, your CyberArks, any kind of password vault, you should be putting those in different segments of your network, because if an attacker gains access to those and is able to elevate their privileges, they can gain secrets and then proliferate their attack. So why is network segmentation hard? Often when I've gone into environments, they were built 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they were built on flat VLANs before we even knew what ransomware was, or obviously it wasn't as popular as it is today. So it's often an afterthought, and when deploying out network segmentation, you often want to engage your network engineers. You need additional equipment, as I mentioned, those internal firewalls, those routers, those layer 3 switches, and that involves a lot of work. That involves planning, that involves re-IPing the network, that involves re-IPing servers, workstations, devices, and ultimately that means downtime. And that's really the thing that prohibits security, I find, in a lot of cases. I think, as Sean Metcalf mentioned here, in the same vein, we're scared to change passwords on service accounts because we don't know what's going to happen. It's going to cause downtime. That prohibits increasing your security posture. Same with network segmentation. If you told me to go re-IP my file server, the first thing I'm going to do is okay, when's a good time to do it? What services I'm going to impact? Who's going to get mad if it's down for 5, 10 minutes, a day, whatever it may be. So a lot of organizations might say, hey, I want to do network segmentation, but I'm really handcuffed in doing so because it's going to cause downtime in my network. Even if you are doing network segmentation, that within a subnet, typically, within a user workstation subnet, all those machines, if they don't have any kind of host-based firewall connected, are never going to pass through a router, never going to pass through an internal firewall or a layer 3 switch that could have ACLs. They're all going to be able to talk to each other directly. And if you don't have any kind of host-based firewall enabled, they're going to be able to communicate over whatever ports and protocols are open up on their workstations. So how can the Windows firewall help? So I asked earlier who's familiar with connection security rules, and I don't know if I even saw any hands. Again, this was something that I learned in my travels, and really what a connection security rule is a feature of the Windows firewall that allows you to build a basically an access control list rule that can limit connections to authorized computers or even groups that computers are in. So if you think about it, that if you establish a connection security rule that says machine A is only allowed to accept connections from computers that are in group ABC, and I'm going to deny all the other connections. So in a file server example, I'm going to open up port 445, and I'm going to say the only machines that can connect over port 445 are computers that are a member of my my client workstation group. So if a rogue machine ends up on the network, that rogue machine out of the gate is most likely not a member of your domain. It's most likely not going to be a member of that security group, and it can't establish a connection to port 445, which is open on that server. So these connection security rules are basically rules that say I need authentication first before you even establish connection. So that does that by basically within every packet, or at least the beginning packet, saying where are you coming from? Okay, cool. Let me grab this, let me recognize your Kerberos ticket and see what group memberships you have and see if I have any connection security rules or firewall rules that say you're allowed to connect to me. So that was a feature of the Windows firewall I was not aware of for many years. And when I saw this, I was like, wait a minute, could we utilize this to establish this network segmentation I was mentioning? We don't need to go and re-IP networks. We don't need to go and deploy out new hardware. I don't even need to talk to my network engineer to do this. I can use Windows Active Directory to establish those groups. I can utilize group policy to deploy out these connection security rules. And then also I could use group policy to deploy out firewall rules that utilize these connection security rules. So really what it's doing is really establishing a secure tunnel every time a connection is requested from one workstation to a server or workstation to workstation. So how do we utilize Active Directory to establish these zones and segments? Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to deploy out a connection security rule into our network. And we're going to deploy out a rule to all our machines that say, hey, if you find a mutual connection that also has a connection security rule set up on it, establish a secure connection. And then we're going to set up security groups, and we're going to put our computers into those security groups. So I kind of went with a tiering model here of, if you guys are familiar with the Microsoft tiering model, tier 2 is basically your user land or your workstations. Tier 1 would be your member servers of like your file servers, your web servers, your database servers, and then tier 0 is really anything that's tied to identity or really highly sensitive data. So I established security groups based on that, and I put in those computer objects into those different groups where I believe they belong. And then lastly, I'm deploying out Windows firewall rules via group policy that establish that Group A can talk to Group B, but Group A cannot talk to Group C. So I'm actually going to run a little lab to show you guys that in reality, because I'm probably terrible at explaining this, and I think a lab really helps explain that. So some Windows firewall misconceptions. What I found is if I suggest it to somebody, they're like, no, don't do it. It's going to break everything. And I've seen that happen. So I can't completely deny that. But also, if I enable it, I'm all good. That's also wrong. Out of the box, from me just deploying out a machine, I went and took a look at the configuration. There's about 250 inbound rules configured by default on just a Windows workstation, and 100 of those are enabled. And a lot of those are basically saying, if you're a member of the domain, come on in, come over any connection. You can ping me, you can RDP me, you can WMI, WinRM, whatever it may be. So that's just like, with an attacker hearing that, is just like, that's ripe for the pickings. So as I mentioned here, there are many of these rules are way overly permissive or not even needed. I don't know how many of you have kind of dove into these rules, but you'll see like rules for like Xbox Live. Like, I haven't actually analyzed that, but I'm like, why the F is that even there? Like, I'm on a Windows 11, Windows 10 Pro machine. Why would I need some kind of rule for Xbox Live? So a lot of these rules are way over permissive in nature, particularly the ones related to the domain. And it's just a nightmare for, the allowed for lateral movement. And I want to give some credit to Jessica Payne here. I'm not sure if she's still with Microsoft, but she did a talk, and also she had a blog that I couldn't find it anymore, on demystifying the Windows firewall. That really, it was kind of the genesis for me doing a deep dive on how could I take what I learned from Jessica's talk here and apply it to potential clients or my own network. And I was able to find a YouTube video, so I would highly recommend watching that. She kind of deep dives how the Windows firewall works. And also, this was a talk that I submitted, I can't remember, maybe 3 or 4 years ago to BSidesCharm, and I was accepted, but that was the year that they ended up canceling because of COVID. So I still had my CFP laying around, and I saw the call for papers for this year, and I was like, let me try that again. So I was fortunate enough to have the BSides crew approve this again. So as time has gone on, I've found that many organizations are kind of going more cloud-based. Obviously, is the concept of the domain going away? Not anytime soon. But I felt that this talk was really prevalent 5 years ago, and it still is. So again, with Jessica's talk there was a blog that she wrote that was awesome 5 years ago that no longer could find, but there's still a YouTube video out there. So thanks to the YouTube crew for keeping that around. So kind of another not so much a misconception, but kind of you want to educate, if you want to do something like this, you need to educate your stakeholders on how do stateful firewalls work. As I mentioned, I would recommend enabling the Windows firewall to clients or to my organization. They'd be like, nope, it's going to break everything. And I was like, well, let me educate you on how a stateful firewall works. So typically in a stateful firewall, or probably always, who knows, but the client will establish or initiate a connection to a destination. So think about my workstation going to ESPN.com. That my client, or basically my browser, is establishing a connection out to ESPN.com. ESPN.com is open on port 80, port 443, and my local firewall is saying, hey, I saw that I allowed an outbound connection for ESPN.com. I'm going to allow that connection to come back. So that's important to kind of know as you're wanting to deploy out firewall rules, particularly on host-based firewalls, is providing that education that, hey, on a stateful firewall, the connections, if you see on the right-hand side here, we're allowing all outbound connections. We're blocking, by default, all inbound connections. And the stateful firewall explains why I'm able to get to ESPN.com and that traffic's able to come back to me. Now, in a stateful firewall, since I'm blocking all connections, it's probably a bad example, but ESPN.com can't connect to me because I'm going to deny that connection because ESPN sourced that connection, and I don't have a rule open for 443 for port 80, so that's why ESPN.com cannot establish a connection to me. So I think the important thing to take away here is on your machine, we're running clients. Typically, your Chrome browser, your Mozilla browser, your Edge browser, your AV agent, your patching agent. Those are all agents on your machine that are most likely sourcing the connection to your server to open up that tunnel to allow that traffic to come back, to allow that patch to come back, to allow that AV configuration to come back. So even if you're blocking inbound connections by default, we're allowing outbound connections by default, and it's those agents that on our machine, basically that software, that is sourcing those connections and making that connection to our server and allowing that traffic to come back in. And rarely, from my experience, do workstations even need to have any ports open to allow unsolicited inbound traffic at all. There might be an exception for an administrative workstation to be able to WMI to your machine, and I'm going to show you in the lab how we could do that. But we want to deny everybody else. Also, with domain controllers, I've found that domain controllers probably need to source the connection to connect to a workstation, and vice versa. Your machine is connecting to a domain controller, so there's ports and protocols obviously that need to be open on a domain controller, but the real takeaway here is that workstations rarely need any kind of ports open to allow for unsolicited inbound traffic. So let's talk about how to potentially deploy a good Windows firewall strategy. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to prep my environment. I'm going to be creating AD security groups. Again, as I mentioned, in the kind of that tiering model, I'm going to be putting my workstations in a tier 2 group. I'm going to be putting my servers, my member servers, in a tier 1 group, and my tier 0 servers in a tier 0 group. In each one of those groups is going to have a different firewall configuration deployed to them. Typically in the tier 2, it's going to be pretty uniform. Your workstations are connecting to client or connecting to servers, and they don't, like as I mentioned, they don't need any kind of inbound traffic open, so they're all going to kind of have a uniform configuration. But when you get to tier 1 and tier 0, you're going to find that web servers operate over port 445. They're going to need those open. Web servers are typically want to be opened up on port 80, port 443. So they're going to need their own firewall configuration. And database servers, SQL's 1443 on TCP. So that's kind of the prep, is deploying out or getting your computers into certain groups, and also prepping out your GPOs that are going to be deploying out your firewall rules that are going to kind of be applied in almost a one-to-one fashion. And we're going to be doing this in 3 phases, an audit mode, a pilot mode, and an enforcement mode. And those are actually 3 different firewall configurations. So in mode 1 is audit, that we're going to be basically within the domain profile for Windows firewall, we're going to be allowing all inbound traffic. I'm fairly confident that if you're not doing anything strong today, that there's no harm in saying let all the traffic come inbound and outbound to any of the devices in audit mode. And that's going to allow us to gain some data. And I'm going to show you a potential means to how to capture the local firewall logs on a workstation or a server, and be able to analyze those to be able to make some rule sets. We're also going to deploy out those connection security rules. So really, we're basically deploying out a rule that says, within that connection security profile, that says, if you're on the domain and you see any connection, attempt to authenticate. And if you can't, that's okay. Still let the connection through. And then we're going to monitor the activity. As we move into pilot mode, we're going to basically pick a couple workstations, a couple member servers, maybe 1 or 2 domain controllers, to put into a mode where we're going to begin to limit the inbound communication. So we're actually going to deploy out the rules that say only allow file server open on port 445 and deny all the rest of the traffic. And if we make any kind of mistake, I'm still able to get onto that file server and deploy a local firewall rule to allow for that connection to be open, just kind of as a fail-safe mechanism. And that's where as you see here, we're going to allow those local rules to be applied. And lastly, enforcement mode. In enforcement mode, we're going to disable all those local rules to be applied. And what I mean by that is if an attacker were to establish presence on a machine and you allow for local rules to be created, that attacker could just create their own rules and just say, I've been denied on connecting to all these servers. Let me stand up my own connection security rule. Let me open up this port. That's the last thing we want them to do. So in enforcement mode via group policy, we're going to say deny the local modification of the host-based firewall entirely, and only allow those changes to come through group policy. Also for our connection security rules, I kind of slipped in there. There's 2 modes. There's request mode of request authentication, and there's require mode. So as you get more confident in your configuration, you could say, hey, I'm going to lock this down that if you can't connect over and you can't provide authentication, I'm not going to let you in at all. So that's where your enforcement mode could come in. And here's the connection security rules deployment phases that I've kind of just spoken to here. So really in audit mode and pilot mode, where we're saying that any machine that gets this configuration, we're going to be requesting authentication on an inbound connection. We really don't care so much about those outbound connections. And we're going to request that authentication to be the computer authentication and via the Kerberos ticket. So what computer's trying to connect to me, and within that, we're going to request that via Kerberos, and in that Kerberos ticket, that ticket will have the group memberships of the computer, and that will line up to the firewall rules that we would be applying. And I'm going to kind of skip to that in a moment here. And we're just going to deploy this out to the domain profile. what I mean, but there's 3 different kind of profiles that can happen on the Windows firewall. That's domain, private, and public. So most likely here, if you connected to the Wi-Fi and you have a Windows machine, it probably applied the public profile. If you're connected to your home network, it's seeing a kind of a private IP address is going to deploy out the private profile. But in most cases, we're going to be applying this in kind of a work setting or a domain setting, and your computer should recognize, hey, I'm on a domain. So we're going to be applying these settings to a domain firewall profile. So as we're configuring the profiles themselves, again, in audit mode, we're going to be basically allowing all those inbound connections. Again, we're going to be applying this to the domain profile. I would not recommend allowing all inbound connections on the public profile. So if you were to do that, basically if you were connected to public Wi-Fi, and there's other people on that Wi-Fi and they're kind of sniffing traffic, they could potentially connect to your machine. So you want to make sure that when you're deploying this out, you're always saying block inbound connections on the domain profile. But in our audit mode on our domain, again, we probably either don't have a firewall enabled or it's poorly configured, that we want to gain some data, we want to gain some intelligence about how our network operates. So we're going to be allowing those inbound connections, and via our Windows firewall log that we're going to be moving to a central repository, that we can begin to analyze that traffic, so that when we move to pilot mode and enforcement mode, we can begin to apply, say, block all traffic with the exception of these rules that I am deploying. So again, in that file server example, I only want the client workstation group to connect over 445. And if you're auditing the logs, you can begin to gain some confidence on this server operates over this port. These are the machines that are connecting. I'm going to make a rule for that, and I'm going to deny the rest of the traffic. So I've kind of alluded this to a couple times. This is my file server example. I feel like this one that kind of is very easy to explain or resonate, but this is a rule I would apply to a file server. So as I'm configuring my my firewall rule within group policy that applies to file servers, I'm going to say basically allow all programs. Again, this is applied directly to the file server. The ports and protocols that I'm going to allow to be open on that local port is port 445. Again, that's your SMB port that allows for you to go use a map drive or whack file server 01 finance drive. So we're going to keep that open. For the action, we're going to say allow this connection if it's secure. So this is where our firewall rule ties back to the connection security rule to say I have a rule that says I only want this connection to happen if it's done so in a secure fashion, and that's where your firewall rule is going to say, hey, did this connection come over via an authenticated method? And the answer is going to hopefully be yes, because we have a connection security rule that says with all the computers in our domain should be authenticating to each other before they establish connections. And then lastly, the authorized computers. So again, on my client workstations, are allowed to connect to port 445 on my file server, and I'm deploying that out on the Windows domain, Windows firewall domain profile. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, how can we gain some data or how can we understand what's going on in our network? And kind of one strategy that I've utilized in this is using Elastic's FileBeat agent. So I'm installing an agent on every machine. You could deploy out this agent to as few or as many machines as you want. But basically, that FileBeats is reading the Windows firewall log. I'm logging all successful and dropped connections, and I'm dumping this into basically a log aggregator. In my case, I just went with Logs.io. It was very easy to set up. I wanted to give a shout out to Logs.io. I'm not endorsing them by any means. I don't even know how I found them. But as I was setting this up, I actually just opened up a chat, and I said, hey, I'm reading the Windows firewall log. Here's a long message string that has a couple fields. Can you build a parser for me? And they had it done in minutes. That probably would have taken me a couple hours to figure out, like, how do I parse this data within their system? And they were just nice enough to do it. Granted, I had a 14-day trial, but as I continue doing this, that's the kind of support that they provide. So now if you're going to a cloud-hosted solution, maybe do a Splunk, Sentinel, whatever it may be, you can work with your logging team or your detection team, and they should easily be able to build a a parser for the Windows Firewall. Like I mentioned, the Logs.io team did it literally in a matter of minutes, and I'm going to show you kind of what my dashboard looks like in that regard. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be showing you a lab example. So I've somehow managed to get all these machines running on this little laptop, and I'm afraid it might crash, so I might have to move a little bit quicker here because I think this thing's starting to overheat. But I've got these machines. So I have two PCs. I have a domain controller, a file server, and what I've labeled as a privileged access workstation. By no means is this like the way to do it, but just kind of, just wanted to show the concept that my privileged access workstation is just a Windows machine that I just wanted to show how you could set up these different security zones. So with the firewall profiles I'm going to be deploying, PC1 and PC2 will not be able to communicate to each other. They also will not be able to source connections to the privileged access workstation, or actually nor so to the file server, except on TCP port 445, your SMB port. In this demo, I have basically any connections open between my PC network or my workstation network and my domain controller, but I would suggest you don't want your workstations connecting to RDP to your domain controller, and I'm going to be showing you basically a rule table that you can deploy to say, here's the domain controller ports and protocols that should be opened on an authenticated manner, and deny everything else. And so we would be denying your PCs from connecting to your domain controller via RDP. So again, I didn't necessarily do that in this lab, but take away that concept if this is something you're looking to deploy. All right. So this is where talks go bad, is when you do labs and demos. All right. So I have a bunch of machines opened up in a hypervisor here, and you guys cannot see that. Let's see. If I knew how to work PowerPoint, probably. There we go. Cool. All right, so kind of just a little proof of concept. Right now, I have all of my workstations, really all of my infrastructure here into all in audit mode. And if we look at our Active Directory here, you can see kind of all the different security groups that I built. And within each of these tiers, I've had to audit, a pilot, and an enforce. So PC1 and PC2 are both currently in tier 2 in audit mode. And as I mentioned earlier, that firewall configuration allows for free traffic to go inbound and outbound. So if I ping PCO2, terrible demo. Let's go with let's ping the paw. All right, I told you this is where demos go to die. So let's see if we can figure out quick what's going on. If I was skilled enough to do that. Oh, look at that. All right. So let's check the firewall settings on this real quick. So firewall. All right. So that is the reason why my computer is not recognizing that it is on a domain network. So I have a little cheat sheet here. Let's see if we can kick this into gear. Let's check PCO2 as well. All right. Let's see if my domain controller can see those machines. Let's see if this can ping file server 01. Well, this is terrible. Let's give this a restart. So what happens, you take your laptop out of your bag 10 minutes before a talk. So here I have, basically this is a registry key hack that tells the network location assistance service that you are on a domain, and keep attempting to speak to the domain controller until you recognize it. So that's where I'm hoping that the network location service is saying, I can't find a domain controller, so I believe I'm on a public network. And therefore, it's not getting the proper firewall configuration. So let's go to PCO2. Yep, so I already have the key there, so it's just having a little line of sight problem to the domain controller. Let's see. Feel like my where's the IPv4? I think all my IPs changed to my virtual network, and so the host names are not gonna want to resolve correctly. Let's see. Exactly. You know, live troubleshooting is always a good thing. So let's see if I can figure this out in the next 20 minutes here. Actually, 10 minutes. That's even more fun. All right. So let's see. Yeah, PCO2.98. That's what I thought it was. And if we look, if we look back at PCO2, I believe that IP changed. Yeah, dot 2933. Can we at least tell me I'm on the same subnet? Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Let's see. $29, okay, that looks right. Let's go into Hyper-V real quick. Virtual Switch Manager. All right, that's on the default switch. That's on the default switch. Yep. Tell me that acronym one more time. NCPN. Did I just have it? NCPA. This is where Windows 11 sucks. Okay. Oh, you know what? That's, yeah. It's yep. So let's disconnect from here maybe. I don't think that's going to help, to be honest, right? Yep. No, I don't need it. Yeah. Yeah, but looks like everything just kind of. Dude, I hope you saved the day. Let's see. That damn B-Sides Wi-Fi. See what happens there. No, I'm not. Just from the Hyper-V. Yeah, I think, well, this is where demos go to die. Because I'm going to have to go fix DNS. I'm going to have to go, do all that fun stuff. Let's see. Yeah. All right. I'm going to skip that for a second. So I'm going to connect back to Wi-Fi real quick and kind of just go to that logs.io that I was mentioning. Yeah, right. Now you're really testing me. Now what the hell happened to my Wi-Fi? Oh, that's right. Thank you. It's awesome having a room full of IT professionals. All right. I'll go to the Trimark guys if I have the Active Directory problem. Well, giant apologies for that. Take my word for it. But really what I was going to show was in that audit mode that PC1 could RDP to PC2, could ping to it. And then when I move PC2 into enforcement mode, the rule set that I was going to have, and hopefully I can get back on the domain controller here, which I can. So we're going to go take a look at the pilot configuration for the host-based firewall for my tier 2 machines. Go to policies, Windows settings, security settings, Windows firewall, and inbound connections. So I configured 2 inbound connections here saying allow the domain controllers to connect to any machine, to any machine in pilot mode and any of the privilege access workstations. So if we take a look at this privilege access workstation rule that's being applied to my tier 0 machines, we could take a look at remote computers, and I said if that computer is within one of these groups, allow the connection. And since I'm only deploying out 2 rules, that all other traffic, inbound traffic, would be dropped. So that's what I was hoping to show you by moving a machine into this pilot mode, that if I went to ping from PC0 or PC01, that's not in an authorized computer group in the enforcement mode that was applied to PC02. So that would block basically all communication from PC1 to PC2. And then the next thing I was going to demo, kind of from a workstation to file server perspective, is taking a look at this rule and showing you it in a live perspective of for your workstations, and the rule that I'm applying to the file server, that the file server is also allowing inbound connections from authorized computers that are in the domain controller groups, that are also with your privileged access workstation groups. That is allowing connections to be sourced from those machines. And then for file services, my client machines in my tier 0 network, which PC1 and PC2 are respectively in each of those groups, that it would be allowed to connect to the local port of 445. So that's what I was hoping to show in the live demo there, but given my terrible preparation, we obviously botched that. And then coming from that logs.io perspective that I wanted to mention, that if you're reading those local firewall audit logs, you could be dumping those into your SIM, you could be dumping those into a log aggregator, and begin to see what traffic is allowed or denied. So if I open up my parser here, you can basically see some activity that was occurring while things were working. Here's the agent name, the source IP, the destination IP, the destination port. So again, on a file server, our machines in the destination port is going to be 445. And are we allowing or dropping that connection? So you can see here that once I deployed those rules in pilot mode, I began to drop traffic that was not approved. Let me see if I can throw this filter on here real quick. And let's go back to like the last day when things were working. So today, let's go yesterday. So when I was preparing for this is what I wanted to show when the .98 here is actually, so we're reading from the agent of PCO1, and you could see .98, this actually was PCO2, that we were allowing an RDP connection over port 3389. But once I put the enforcement mode, or the pilot mode in, which was essentially enforcing the rules, I began to drop those requests. So that's how you could utilize reading these logs from the Windows firewall to make educated decisions on what ports and protocols need to be opened to allow for your network to continue to operate, and put those rules in place prior to deploying that out. And then when you're in pilot mode, if you made any mistakes, you can make a local firewall rule change if you needed to. And to finish up here, so I kind of stumbled into this, and I was hoping I didn't want to, but on the bottom half here, one thing I found when things were working somewhat properly, that my network location service was not recognizing I was on a domain. As you guys saw there, that is what was occurring because I botched up the network. So all those machines were applying the public profile for the Windows firewall and not the domain profile, which I was working on. So that's why my demo basically failed. But this registry setting, when networking is working properly, would tell that workstation or that server, continue trying to communicate to the domain controller to understand you need a domain profile. Another thing that I found is I don't know if you label it as a bug, but when deploying out the rules that I said turn on the Windows firewall logging, and the log file was not being generated. Started to Google it and stumbled across this Microsoft article, and they said, yeah, this is a known issue. You could probably read into it as to why, but this is a little script that they provide to basically run on each machine to say, fix all the ACLs on the folder where the firewall log gets dropped to, and allow that write to happen for the firewall to dump its logs into that file. So if you wanted to start to read this traffic and you realize that your firewall logs are not getting written, you might need to run this script. And common ports and protocols, as I mentioned, for domain controllers, on the right-hand side there, these are basically all the ports and protocols that operate on, I think, a Windows 2008 R2 and higher in a forest functional level. If you're below that, I hope you're not. There's actually different ports and protocols. Really, it's the dynamic ports at the bottom there, the DFSR port range, that is a little bit different for a domain that's running on a functional level. I believe it's lower than 2008 R2. And then on the left-hand side, these are just some common servers that run within your network. So we talked about, I'm having DHCP problems. I'm getting IPs that I didn't expect. But those are ports and protocols that you would need open on a DHCP server. You might want to say don't require or don't worry about the connection security rules for a domain controller. Just open up that IP and that port without any kind of connection security rule. And also for database servers, web servers, and DNF servers. So again, I want to apologize. I'm really sad, but my demo didn't work. But I'm hoping at least the PowerPoint slides could really fill in the gaps of how this could actually be deployed out into a network to provide network segmentation. And again, my name is Mike Burns. I just want to thank everybody for taking a listen. I'm happy to answer any questions. In the what network? Yep. Yep. And into the security group that we configured a rule for. Yep. 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 Right. Yeah, so basically, if that attacker came into your workstation VLAN and they had basic user credentials, the hope is that via the firewall rules, that machine will not be in any of those security groups that are allowed to connect to the other machines. And if you're prohibiting that, then you're hopefully prohibiting them gaining credentials elsewhere on other machines, running Mimikatz on other machines, connecting laterally to other machines. So you're really kind of stopping them in their tracks of doing their lateral movement and hoping to gain higher level credentials where they could then say, now I have higher level credentials, I'm going to take my machine, I'm going to register it to the domain, I'm going to add it to the security group that can also speak to other machines. So really you're hoping to stop really their first step of, yeah, I'm in the network, I have an IP, awesome, but I have all these host-based firewall rules set up that are based on Active Directory security groups, and that machine is not in any of those groups, so it can't even connect. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so what I found in my testing was like if I opened up a connection on port 445, that connection would remain open for a while. And I had to go onto the file server and I ran like TCP view and said close connection. So there is, I'm not sure how long that connection would stay open, but the file server, they recognize, hey, I'm just going to keep this connection open to smooth out the, more requests. That's a great question. I did not try that scenario. So if I pushed out that rule while a connection was open, I'm not sure what would happen in that case. I'm hoping that the firewall would say, let me kind of reset all my connections and reestablish them and enforce the new rule set. Yep, exactly. And that's what I was doing with TCP view. Yeah, yep. Yeah, so I never went that in depth. I was really just hoping to establish that that authenticated connection from computer to computer. And I think what you're mentioning is like within the Windows firewall, you can also say like this program is allowed to speak outbound on this port and protocol. I've never worked with Windows Firewall in that regard, but I know that that's also a great security control. And again, this is kind of, this application doesn't apply to every network. I would probably suggest, probably small, medium business networks that this strategy could work in, but also it's security in layers too. Like I mentioned, I had one PAW machine. Well, I'm connecting up from that PAW machine to a workstation with domain admin. You still want to have your tiering of, in your authentication silos as well. I'm just hoping to stop that lateral movement by deploying out rule sets to say, computer A is not allowed to talk to computer B because it's not in the authorized computer group. Only domain controllers can authorize that inbound connection. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question because, as I mentioned, the way this authentication is happening that I've done kind of testing with is Kerberos, but another way you can do authentication is through certificates. So what you could do for a Linux server that needs to do like an authorized connection is that you can, you could generate a certificate for that Linux machine and from your Active Directory, so your ADCS server, apply that certificate to that machine and then say allow certificate-based authentication, not necessarily Kerberos. So that's another type of connection security rule is like I was setting up computer authentication based on Kerberos, but you can also set up computer authentication based on PKI. So that's how you would get like a non-domain joined machine to be able to connect to domain joined machines. Yep. Oh, well, yeah, 100%. Yep. 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 Yeah, like I said, I mentioned the certificate services is one strategy I recognized of like how could I get a non 80 join machine to communicate to 80 join machines, and you would deploy out a certificate from your Active Directory to that machine, so it would use that to say, hey, I'm Linux machine 123. I'm I have authority within your AD domain to connect to this machine. Yeah, I think that's when it moves to like the PKI. So I'm not sure how much. Yeah. Yep. 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 Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I'm sure you absolutely could. Yep. Yeah. You speak a little louder. Oh yeah, 100%. That there's again, this is only one strategy. Is like kind of almost the network layer that within Active Directory itself, you could also say deny logon locally for these for these groups of users, and also don't. I'm trying to go back to my more so hardcore Active Directory days, but like don't allow anybody that's a local administrator to establish a remote connection to another machine. So I would use those strategies on top of this one, and this one's more of kind of like again the focus of the talk was like, how could I do network segmentation without a network engineer? I could dump my computers into computer groups and set up firewall rules to say group A can talk to group B, but group A can't talk to group C. Yep. I'm really pissed that demo didn't work, but it's the way the cookie crumbles. So I think I'm going over time. I thank you very much to everybody, and if you have any questions, I'll be around.